to tell you, hey, maybe you owe this artist some money. You've been listening to their music a lot, and my records don't say you ever bought an album from them. Okay, so that's one question. On the other side, Madonna is very rich, undoubtedly. And traditionally in utilitarianism, moving money from poor people to rich people is bad because the money is less useful to the rich people than it is to the poor people. So does that mean that you should never ethically give money to Madonna for her music? Maybe that's the case under some ethical theories, but we need to be really careful if we're applying this kind of reasoning. One, because it's kind of arguably selfish, but secondly, perhaps Radiohead and Nine Inch Nails, who receive a lot less criticism for their role in the world of music, are essentially the same as Madonna. Those artists are very wealthy, and if we really are serious about this, maybe we wouldn't be paying them either. Unless we're giving them incentives to do disruptive things like Radiohead and Nine Inch Nails have done. Radiohead giving away its albums at whatever price you name. Trent Reznor of Nine Inch Nails getting up in front of his audiences and saying, hey, my albums are too expensive, you should pirate them. And this leads to the major label question. So some people might say, well, this record label or this film studio is evil, and so therefore I'm not going to pay money to them. Now, whether it's arguably at all true that certain record labels are kind of bad depends a lot on the details of the industry that you're talking about. And there are subtle things about record labels that make us think they're evil when, okay, maybe they do bad things, but they're less bad than we think. In order to understand how this works, you actually need to look into the accounting books of a modern record label, and what you see is they'll sign 10 bands, and out of those 10 bands, for each of them they'll spend a huge amount of money, traditionally about $1 million, on video clips and advertising and shopping malls all over the United States, and limousines and caviar in order to produce their first album. That's $1 million that the record label has spent. So $10 million in total across the 10 bands. And then 9 of those 10 bands will lose money. They won't ever make back $1 million. So the 10th band makes money, but the 10th band never gets paid under their contract because all the money that they earned gets taken out and used to pay for the other 9 bands that were not profitable. So it's possible for a record label to be screwing its artists and making a loss at the same time, which is counterintuitive. And maybe our objections to this kind of system are something to do with the way that music gets promoted in shopping malls rather than about the business structure or about the kind of music it is. And so before we sort of say, let's outright condemn record labels, we have to sort of think, well, do you really not like glitzy top 40 music? Maybe there are some people who say, yeah, I listen to top 40 music because it gets stuck in my head and I want to pirate it, but I really wish it didn't exist and there was more such music in the world. And for those people, okay, it's ethical to go and pirate stuff. But for the rest of us, we need to think more closely about this question, I think. Anyway, just gathering all the stuff I've said, there's a second draft of an algorithm, for music at least here. So let's talk through how it would work. Start with one album that you purchased and you really liked. It was considered a good purchase. It gives you a way to value how much you care about music. And then you look up that album in your iTunes playlist and you say, okay, how many times did I listen to that album? And that gives you a value per listen for you, subjectively. And then you can go through the rest of your music collection and infer a value for everything else that you've got in there. And that gives you a kind of notional debt to each artist. Then you subtract from each artist's debt the amount you spent on t-shirts and concert tickets and CDs. And then you get a leftover debt. Perhaps you want to permute this process for how wealthy the artists are. If you really think that money should go to small bands instead of Madonna, okay, take some of the money and rearrange it based on research about the contracts that these artists have and how wealthy they are. Maybe in that extreme case where you really don't like top 40 music and want to kill it, but you still want to listen to it, okay, permute for that if you really want to. And then at the end, let's have a piece of software that pops up and says, oh, hey, you know, I see you've been listening to a lot of this stuff. Maybe it's time you paid some money to that artist. So I think this theory is compatible, or this proposal or algorithm is compatible with a bunch of those ethical theories I talked about before. All the utilitarian ones, some of the justice-based ones, not the justice-based theory that says only rewards that are earned are fair, because that justice theory says that piracy is never ethical. You never earned something you pirated. You never paid for it, so you shouldn't pirate it. And it's clearly not compatible with strict law-abiding theories that don't have room for civil disobedience. If we think we have broken laws and we can't change them because the political process is so entrenched, if we think despite that we should still obey the law, then absolutely, piracy should be forbidden. But clearly we live in a world where that's not the view of a large percentage of the population, and so I suppose that's my audience for this argument. So in conclusion, this second draft algorithm is really just a draft, and I expect it to contain bugs that people would find and shake out, and I guess part of my argument was that this should be a collective project that perhaps the peer-to-peer and hacker community should be interested in. But it also seems like a necessary effort in a world where we have laws that say do not pirate and facts that say 50% of the population pirates on a regular basis. And when we have that massive divergence, well, I think research is needed on this question of how to behave in the space in between. So that's my argument. I hope there are some questions or criticisms I can get from you guys. I think there's a microphone in the middle there. And you could queue up and no one steal a spot in the queue from anyone else.
Yeah, I guess the big problem I have with your theory, or at least the one you went into, is in the beginning you said we should work on this together. We shouldn't have our own personal ideas. This is wrong to me in every level. I mean, I agree we should all work on it together. We should all agree what we collectively think is right. But if you say we shouldn't have our own personal ethics, then you're entering a very dangerous area. I think everyone should always be thinking about their ethics and thinking about the collective ethics. Because
so that's actually a really good point, and I actually didn't explain this in sufficient detail on the way through. One of the criticisms of ACT utilitarianism, which is the traditional version, which says, you know, Alice, you should do whatever makes the people in the world as well off as possible, as happy as possible. I want you to maximize society's well-being for every action that you take. The problem there is that she doesn't know the consequences of most of her actions. And so if she really tried to follow that theory naively, she would spend all of her day sitting there worrying about the consequences of actions. And that would be self-defeating because she would never do anything. She would never make the people around her happy because she'd be sitting there worrying about ethics all the time. So the argument isn't that we shouldn't individually think about these questions, but that we should trade off idealized theories with practical ways of living our lives on a day-to-day basis. And the same thing, I think, applies to whether you talk about this as a collective research project or as an individual kind of thing that we should think about. You should do both, but you shouldn't have everyone necessarily repeating the thinking of that's done by everyone around them. Let's try and share our conclusions and also have some room for individual variation on